Julian Reyes had learned, over 11 years of marriage, that silence was not weakness. It was armor. He sat in the glass-walled office at the end of the executive floor, the smallest one, tucked in the corner like an afterthought, and watched his wife's name glow on the lobby screen 3 floors below. Vanessa Cade, Chief Executive Officer, Cade Reyes Holdings. His name wasn't on that screen anymore. It hadn't been for 6 months. When they'd built the company together 12 years ago, it was Reyes and Cade Ventures, his logistics expertise, her sales instinct, a scrappy startup that grew into a billion-dollar holding company. But somewhere between the second funding round and the corner penthouse, the company had quietly become just Vanessa's. And so, it seemed, had their marriage. Julian wasn't blind. He'd noticed the late strategy dinners with Damon Ashcroft, the newly promoted VP of Operations, a man 12 years younger than Julian, with a jaw like it was carved for boardroom photographs and an ambition that made Julian's skin crawl the first time they'd shaken hands. He'd noticed how Vanessa's phone now had a passcode, how her perfume changed, how she stopped asking him to weigh in on decisions that used to require both their signatures. He said nothing. Not yet. That morning, the email had landed in his inbox at 7:14 a.m., 3 minutes before the board meeting. Subject: Organizational Restructuring. Executive Committee. Julian Reyes, co-founder and chief strategy officer, was being transitioned to an advisory role, effective immediately, pending board ratification. His office would be reassigned. His executive parking spot, the one with his name still stenciled on the concrete, would go to Damon Ashcroft, whose new title, buried in paragraph 3, was Chief Strategy Officer. His job, his title, handed to his wife's lover, in writing, before Julian had even finished his coffee. He read it twice. Then he closed his laptop, straightened his tie, and walked to the boardroom. Not to beg, not to fight, but because Julian Reyes had never once in 12 years missed a board meeting. He wasn't about to start today. Vanessa was already at the head of the table when he walked in, Damon seated 2 chairs down like he belonged there. Like this had been rehearsed, choreographed, waiting only for Julian's exit cue. "Julian," Vanessa said, not quite meeting his eyes. "We were going to call you after the meeting." "I got the email," Julian said quietly, taking his usual seat, the one that, for now, was still his. Before the meeting, apparently, a ripple of discomfort moved around the table. Eleanor Voss, the board's chairwoman, a silver-haired woman who had sat on more Fortune 500 boards than anyone in the room had years of experience, watched Julian with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not pity, something closer to appraisal. "This restructuring reflects where the company needs to go," Vanessa continued, sliding a folder toward the center of the table like she was closing a routine transaction. "Damon has proven himself in operations. Strategy needs fresh energy. It's not personal, Julian. Not personal." As if she hadn't shared his bed for over a decade. As if the man now smirking faintly 2 seats down hadn't been sharing it more recently than either of them knew Julian was aware of. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the folder shut or storm out, the way 12 years of pride might have demanded. He simply looked at his wife, really looked at her, the way you look at a stranger you're trying to place, and said the only thing that mattered. "This isn't a restructuring, Vanessa. This is a replacement." Silence. Even Damon's smirk faltered. "The board will vote," Eleanor said smoothly, breaking the tension, "at next month's session, once the transition committee completes its review." Vanessa's eyes flicked toward Eleanor. A flash of something Julian recognized instantly. Not confidence. Concern. She hadn't expected a review. She'd expected a formality. Julian said nothing else. He gathered his folder, nodded once to the room, and walked out. Past the parking spot with his name still on it. Past the office that would soon belong to someone else. Past 12 years of a life built on a foundation he was only now realizing had never included him as an equal. He didn't know yet that Eleanor Voss had already begun making calls of her own. Eleanor Voss did not like being surprised in boardrooms, and Vanessa Cade's restructuring memo had surprised her. Not because executive transitions were unusual. She'd sat through dozens over 4 decades in corporate governance. What unsettled her was the speed. Julian Reyes, co-founder, the man whose logistics algorithms had single-handedly kept Silentttt Reyes Holdings solvent during the supply chain collapse 3 years ago, was being quietly erased from the org chart in a memo sent minutes before a meeting, with his replacement's promotion already drafted, signed, and dated 2 weeks prior. 2 weeks, which meant this decision had been made long before it reached the board. That evening, Eleanor invited Priya Malhotra, the company's general counsel, for a quiet dinner at a restaurant far enough from headquarters that no one would recognize them together. "You've seen the restructuring file," Eleanor said, once the wine had been poured and the small talk exhausted. Priya, ever careful with her words, chose them like she was defusing something. "I drafted the compliance language. I didn't draft the decision." Did Julian know Damon Ashcroft's promotion was already finalized before the board saw it? No, Priya said. "I don't think he even knew about Damon and Vanessa until recently." "He's not stupid, Eleanor. He's just loyal." Or he was. Eleanor swirled her glass slowly. She had known Julian for 9 years, long enough to recognize the particular exhaustion in his eyes at today's meeting. Not anger, grief. The look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had been quietly dug out for months, maybe longer. "I want the full financials," Eleanor said. "Everything Damon Ashcroft has touched since his promotion to VP. Every contract, every vendor change, every signature that doesn't have a paper trail explaining it." Priya's fork paused halfway to her plate. "You think this is about more than an affair?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that a man doesn't get promoted twice in 18 months without either extraordinary talent or extraordinary leverage. And everything I've read about Damon Ashcroft's operational record suggests it isn't talent." 3 days later, Priya arrived at Eleanor's office with a folder thick enough to require both hands. "Eastbridge Logistics," Priya said, laying the first document on the desk. "A vendor contract Damon pushed through 6 months ago, bypassing procurement's standard 3-bid process. Cost the company $400,000 more than our previous supplier. And Eastbridge Logistics is registered to a holding company in Delaware. That holding company's registered agent shares an address with a consulting firm called Ashcroft Strategic Partners." Priya let that sit for a moment. "Founded by Damon's brother. 6 weeks before the contract was signed." Eleanor set down her pen. "He's been skimming the company through a shell vendor. And Vanessa signed off on it." "Vanessa signed off on everything Damon submitted for the last 8 months," Priya said quietly. "Every contract, every budget increase. No second signature, no review, because Julian, the person who used to co-sign every major vendor decision, had already been quietly cut out of the approval chain months before this week's memo. The picture was forming now, and it was uglier than an affair. This wasn't a woman falling for a younger executive. This was a woman systematically dismantling her husband's authority to protect someone who was actively bleeding the company dry. Someone she may not have even realized was doing it, blinded by whatever she believed the relationship was. Eleanor closed the folder. "Julian doesn't know any of this yet," she said. "No," Priya agreed. "He thinks he just lost his job to his wife's affair. He doesn't know he might be the only person who can stop the company from losing millions more." Eleanor stood, walked to the window overlooking the city Silentttt Reyes Holdings had helped build, and made a decision that would take 4 weeks to fully execute. A decision that would end not with Julian Reyes quietly accepting an advisory title, but with an entirely different vote placed before the board. "Give me everything," Eleanor said. And Priya, not a word to Vanessa. Not yet. The advisory office they gave Julian didn't have a window. It had a desk, a chair, a phone that rarely rang, and a stack of strategic advisory materials that amounted to nothing more than reports someone had already finished reading before sending to him. It was, Julian understood within the first hour, a corporate hospice, a place to keep a founder quiet and paid while the real decisions happened 3 floors up, in the office that used to be his. He went anyway, every day, on time, dressed the way he always had. Not out of hope, out of principle. The same principle that had made him walk into that first board meeting after the email, when every instinct told him to disappear instead. Vanessa avoided him in the hallways now, when their paths did cross. Near the elevators, once in the parking garage, she offered the same brittle politeness you'd give a former colleague, not a husband of 12 years. as though the marriage, like his title, had already been quietly restructured out of existence and nobody had thought to tell him the effective date. He'd moved into the guest room 3 weeks ago. She hadn't objected. It was Marcus. No, Julian corrected the reflex, an old habit from thinking about other people's stories. Not his own. It was his life now, reduced to a windowless office in a house that no longer felt like his. He was rereading a supply chain report he'd already memorized when Priya knocked on his door frame, closing it behind her before she'd even said hello. "I need you to look at something," she said, "and I need you to not react loudly, because these walls are thinner than people think." She placed the Eastbridge logistics file on his desk. Julian read in silence for 11 minutes. Priya watched him the way you'd watch someone receive difficult medical news, bracing for the moment the calm cracked. It didn't crack. It sharpened. "Damon's brother," Julian said finally, tapping the shell company's registration. "This isn't sloppy. This is careful. Someone taught him how to structure this. Someone with operational access and no oversight," Priya said. "Someone who used to have a co-signer on every major contract." Julian looked up. "Me." "You," Priya confirmed. "The moment you were cut out of the approval chain, there was no one left checking Damon's work except Vanessa. And Vanessa trusts him in ways that appear to have compromised her judgment. Eleanor thinks it's gone on for at least 8 months. Possibly longer." Julian sat back, and for the first time since the email had landed in his inbox, something other than grief moved through him. It felt disturbingly like clarity. Does Vanessa know? Eleanor doesn't think so. Not the extent of it, anyway. She may know Damon cut corners. She almost certainly doesn't know he's been paying his own brother through a shell company with her signature. Julian closed the folder slowly, the way a man closes a door he intends to open again later, on his own terms. "Why are you showing me this instead of taking it straight to the full board?" Priya hesitated, and in that hesitation, Julian understood something had shifted beneath the surface of Cadre's holdings that went beyond his own removal. "Because Eleanor doesn't think the board should hear this from Vanessa's legal counsel," Priya said. "She thinks it should come from the person who built this company's operational backbone in the first place. The person Damon Ashcroft's fraud was specifically designed to work around." "Eleanor sent you." "Eleanor sent me," Priya confirmed, "to ask if you're ready to stop being quiet." Julian looked down at his hands that had signed the original incorporation papers 12 years ago, hands that had built spreadsheets and shipping routes and contingency plans while Vanessa closed deals and gave interviews, hands that had, for 6 months, done nothing but hold a coffee cup in a windowless room while his life was dismantled around him. "I was never quiet because I was weak," he said finally. "I was quiet because I was watching. Tell Eleanor I'm ready to stop watching." It took Julian 11 days to build the case Priya and Eleanor needed. 11 days of nights spent at his kitchen table instead of asleep, cross-referencing shipping manifests, vendor invoices, and budget approvals with the precision that had once made him the most trusted operational mind in the company. He worked alone mostly. Vanessa noticed nothing. She barely noticed him at all anymore. Drifting through the house, they still technically shared like a guest who'd overstayed a reservation neither of them had the energy to correct. What Julian found went far beyond the Eastbridge Shell Company. Damon Ashcroft had, over 18 months, funneled contracts through no fewer than 3 separate vendors connected to family members or college friends, inflating costs by nearly $2.8 million, all approved under Vanessa's signature, all conveniently timed after Julian's authority had been quietly stripped from the approval chain, one small revision at a time, so gradually that no single change had ever looked alarming on its own. It was, Julian realized with a cold sort of admiration, an elegant kind of theft. Not the kind that got caught in an audit. The kind that got caught only by someone who remembered exactly how the systems used to work before someone patiently, deliberately broke them. He built a timeline, then a financial model. Then, working with Priya late one evening in her office with the blinds drawn, a full presentation, clean, undeniable, utterly without emotion, because Julian knew that the moment this became about the affair instead of the fraud, Vanessa would find a way to make it about him being a bitter husband instead of a wronged co-founder. "This isn't revenge," he told Priya, reviewing the final slide. "This is math." "It's both," Priya said gently. "You're allowed to let it be both." Eleanor reviewed the presentation on a Thursday evening, in the same quiet restaurant where this had all begun. She read every page twice, her expression unreadable. And when she finished, she looked at Julian with something that might have been respect. "You built this in 11 days. I had motivation. This isn't just enough to remove Damon Ashcroft," Eleanor said. "This is enough to reconsider the entire leadership structure. The board doesn't just need to see fraud, Julian. They need to see who's capable of leading this company without it happening again." Julian understood, slowly, what she was suggesting, and it wasn't reinstatement to his old title. It was something else entirely. "You're not talking about giving me my job back." "No," Eleanor said. "I'm talking about the board voting you in as chairman." The word landed strangely in Julian's chest. Not triumph. Not yet, but something quieter and more foundational. Chairman wasn't a consolation prize for a wronged husband. It was oversight, authority, the power to ensure that what happened to him, the quiet, methodical stripping of a founder's influence until he was invisible in his own company, could never happen to anyone else, including eventually to Vanessa herself, if her judgment continued down this path. "She'll fight it," Julian said. "She'll try," Eleanor agreed. "But Vanessa built this company on operational integrity, Julian, whatever's happened in her marriage. When she sees what Damon actually did with the trust she gave him, not just the affair, but the money, the fraud, the risk to everything she's built, I don't think she'll have much fight left. I think, underneath the mess, she still cares more about this company than she cares about protecting him." Julian wasn't so sure, but he no longer needed to be sure. He needed only to be ready. "When's the vote?" 2 weeks, Eleanor said. "Full board. And Julian, Damon won't see it coming. Neither will Vanessa. You've spent 6 months being underestimated in a windowless office. Let them keep underestimating you for 2 more weeks." For the first time since the restructuring email, Julian felt something settle into place inside him. Not anger, not yet triumph, but the quiet, load-bearing certainty of a man who finally understood exactly what he was building toward. Vanessa found out about the fraud investigation the same way she'd found out about most operational problems over the last year. By accident, and far too late to control it. It was a Tuesday evening when Damon called her, his voice tighter than she'd ever heard it. "Priya Malhotra requested every contract I've signed since March. Every one. Vanessa, someone's building a file. On you, or on the department? On me." A pause. "I need you to make it go away." Vanessa sat very still in her home office, the one she'd claimed after Julian moved into the guest room, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not because she suspected fraud, not yet, but because Damon's voice had a particular note in it she recognized from 12 years of marriage to a very different kind of man. Julian's instinct, when something went wrong, had always been to explain it calmly and fix it. Damon's instinct was to make it disappear. "What exactly is in these contracts, Damon?" "Nothing that isn't defensible," he said, too quickly. "Vendor relationships. Normal business." Then let Priya look at them. Silence. And in that silence, Vanessa Cade, sharp enough to have built a billion-dollar company from nothing, understood that she had missed something. Something that had been happening under her signature, in her company, while she was too distracted, too flattered, too invested in Damon Ashcroft to check his work the way she'd once checked everyone's work, including her own husband's. She didn't call Julian. Pride wouldn't let her, not yet. Instead, she called Eleanor directly, the next morning, demanding to know what the board was investigating. Eleanor didn't soften it. "Vendor fraud," she said simply. "Approximately $2.8 million routed through shell companies connected to Damon's family and associates. All approved under your signature, over 18 months, during a period when your co-signer authority, Julian's, was systematically removed from the process." Vanessa's hand tightened on the phone. "Removed by whom?" "That," Eleanor said, "is a question you'll need to answer for yourself, Vanessa. Because the paperwork shows the changes were requested by your office." The accusation didn't need to be spoken aloud. Vanessa understood it instantly. Every small procedural change she'd approved over the last year, believing she was streamlining operations, believing she was trusting Damon the way a CEO should trust her VP, had in fact been carefully engineered to remove the one person who might have caught what he was doing. And she had signed every one of those changes herself, distracted by an affair she convinced herself was harmless. She confronted Damon that night, in the apartment he kept across town. The one she'd told herself for 8 months was simply convenient for late meetings. Is it true? Damon didn't deny it the way an innocent man would have. He explained it the way guilty men often do when they've already decided the relationship is no longer worth protecting. The company owed me more than it was paying me, Vanessa. You know that. I found a way to correct the balance. You stole from my company. Our company, he corrected, and something in the casual certainty of that word. Our, as though 8 months of an affair had made him an owner, told Vanessa everything she needed to know about how thoroughly she had been played. She left without another word. Driving home in the dark, Vanessa found herself, for the first time in months, thinking clearly about Julian. Not with guilt, not yet, but with the cold recognition of someone recalculating a decision she'd made too quickly. Julian had never once in 12 years needed her to check his work. He had never once tried to make himself irreplaceable by making her vulnerable. Whatever else was true about her marriage, whatever had gone wrong between them, Julian Reyes had never been a threat to the company they'd built. She had traded a man who protected her blind spots for one who had built his entire position by exploiting them. By the time she reached the house, the guest room light was on. She stood outside the door for a long moment, unsure whether she had the right to knock, before finally walking past it to the office where, until 6 months ago, they had made every major decision together. The board vote was 1 week away, and for the first time since the restructuring memo, Vanessa Cade was afraid of what it would reveal about her. Not about Damon, not about Julian, but about the choices that had led her here. Eleanor Voss did not believe in ambushes. She believed, instead, in inevitability delivered with maximum clarity, which was why, for days before the board vote, she requested a private meeting with Vanessa alone. You're going to remove Damon, Vanessa said, before Eleanor had even finished sitting down. It wasn't a question. The board will vote to terminate his employment for cause. Yes, Eleanor said. The fraud is documented beyond dispute. Legal will pursue restitution. That part isn't in question. And the rest? Eleanor folded her hands on the table. The rest depends on what kind of leader the board believes this company needs going forward. And Vanessa, I'll be direct because I think you'd want me to be. The board's confidence in your judgment has been damaged. Not by the affair. Boards don't vote on marriages, but by the pattern it revealed. 18 months of unchecked authority handed to someone unqualified for it, and a systematic removal of the one oversight structure, your husband's co-signature, that might have caught it sooner. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. You built this company with real talent, Vanessa, Eleanor continued. Nobody on that board doubts your instincts for growth, for deals, for vision. But a company this size needs more than vision. It needs structure, oversight, someone whose judgment isn't compromised by personal entanglement with the people making operational decisions. You're proposing Julian as chairman. The board is proposing it, Eleanor corrected gently. I'm simply telling you before the vote happens, because I think you deserve to hear it from me rather than read it in a memo, the way Julian did 6 months ago. The comparison landed exactly as intended. Vanessa flinched just slightly, and Eleanor watched a version of the woman she'd known for a decade resurface. Not the CEO who had grown careless, but the founder who had once, years ago, insisted on Julian's title being equal to her own, back when equity meant something to her beyond a signature on a cap table. He'll want to punish me, Vanessa said quietly. After everything. I've worked with Julian Reyes for 9 years, Eleanor said. I've never once seen him choose punishment when correction was available instead. That's not weakness, Vanessa. Whatever you may have mistaken it for during your marriage. That's a different kind of strength than the one you and Damon share. It's the kind that doesn't need an audience to prove it exists. Vanessa sat with that for a long moment, the accusation and the compliment tangled together in a way that felt uncomfortably like the truest thing anyone had said to her in months. What does the board expect from me at the vote? Honesty, Eleanor said simply. About what happened, about your role in enabling it, and about whether you're prepared to work under a restructured governance model. One where the chairman has real oversight authority, not an advisory title with no window and no power. The reference to Julian's exile wasn't lost on Vanessa. She absorbed it the way you absorb a diagnosis you've been avoiding, quietly, painfully, and with the beginning of acceptance. And if I fight the vote, then you'll likely lose more than the chairmanship, Eleanor said. The board's confidence in the CEO's seat isn't unconditional either, Vanessa. I'd encourage you to consider which battle is actually worth fighting, and which one is simply pride refusing to recognize it's already lost. Vanessa left the meeting without another word, but Eleanor noted, with quiet satisfaction, that she hadn't argued, hadn't threatened, hadn't reached for the practiced confidence that had carried her through 100 boardroom negotiations. For the first time in longer than either of them could probably name, Vanessa Cade looked like a woman finally seeing the full shape of what she'd allowed to happen. Not just to her marriage, not just to her company, but to the version of herself who used to know the difference between confidence and blindness. For days remained until the vote, and somewhere across the city, in a windowless office he no longer needed, Julian Reyes was preparing not for revenge, but for the quiet, structural work of making sure no one, not Damon, not a future Damon, not even Vanessa herself, could ever again dismantle a company by dismantling the person who'd built its foundation. The boardroom was fuller than usual the morning of the vote. Every seat occupied, phones silenced, the particular electricity of a room that knew history was about to be decided rather than merely discussed. Julian arrived early, as he always did, and took the same seat he'd occupied for 12 years, the one that 6 months ago he'd feared he was sitting in for the last time. Vanessa arrived next alone. No Damon. His termination had been finalized 3 days earlier, along with a referral to the company's outside counsel for potential criminal fraud charges. She sat at the head of the table out of habit, then, after a visible hesitation, moved one seat down, a small gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Eleanor called the meeting to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Before we proceed to the formal agenda, she said, I want to address what every person in this room already knows. 18 months of vendor fraud, totaling approximately $2.8 million, was perpetrated by former VP of Operations Damon Ashcroft, enabled by a systematic erosion of the company's internal oversight structure. That erosion specifically targeted the removal of co-signing authority previously held by Julian Reyes. She let the words settle before continuing. The board's investigation, led by General Counsel Priya Malhotra with operational analysis provided by Julian Reyes himself, has been thorough and is now complete. Termination and legal proceedings against Mr. Ashcroft are already underway. What remains before this board today is a governance decision. How do we ensure this company is never again vulnerable to this kind of failure? Julian sat still, hands folded, giving nothing away, the same posture he'd held in the first meeting 6 months ago when his job had been taken from him in a 3-line email. The room, this time, was watching him instead of past him. The board's governance committee recommends the following, Eleanor continued. First, immediate reinstatement of dual signature authority on all vendor and operational contracts above $50,000. Second, the creation of an independent chairman position with direct oversight of the CEO's operational decisions, reporting only to the full board. Third, she paused, looking directly at Julian for the first time. The board nominates Julian Reyes for that chairman position, effective immediately upon vote. A murmur moved through the room, though most of those present had already heard the outline in advance. All eyes shifted, inevitably, to Vanessa. She stood slowly. Julian watched her, unsure what to expect. Defense, deflection, the practiced confidence he'd watched her deploy in 100 negotiations. Instead, she did something he hadn't seen from her in over a year. She looked directly at him and spoke without armor. I built half of this company on Julian's judgment, she said, her voice steady but quieter than usual. I let myself forget that, somewhere in the last 2 years, I mistook comfort for weakness, and I mistook someone else's confidence for competence. Both mistakes nearly cost this company everything. She turned to the board. I support the nomination, not because I have to, because it's correct and because it's overdue. The room went silent in a different way now, not tense but weighted, aware that something more significant than a policy change had just occurred in that admission. Eleanor called the vote. It was unanimous. Julian Reyes, chairman of Cade Reyes Holdings, effective immediately. He didn't smile, not yet, not out of restraint, but because the moment didn't feel like triumph so much as correction, the restoration of a structure that should never have been dismantled in the first place. He shook hands around the table, accepted the quiet congratulations of colleagues who, 6 months ago, had watched him walk out of this same room without a word of protest. When the room finally cleared, only Vanessa remained, standing near the window, watching the city the way she had years ago, before any of this, before Damon, before the memo, before the slow erosion that had cost them both more than either had fully understood until now. "Congratulations, Chairman Reyes," she said quietly. "Thank you," Julian said. And then, because it needed to be said, and because he finally had the standing, professional and personal, to say it without it sounding like either weakness or victory. "This was never about taking anything from you, Vanessa. It was about making sure no one could ever do to this company, or to anyone in it, what almost happened here." Vanessa nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, something like honesty passed between them. Not reconciliation, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the way it had once existed. But respect, earned, unglamorous, and long overdue. The office they gave Julian as chairman had windows on 2 sides. He noticed it the first morning, standing at the glass, looking down at the same lobby screen that had once displayed only Vanessa's name. It now read, Vanessa Cade, Chief Executive Officer, Julian Reyes, Chairman of the Board. 2 names, properly balanced the way it should have been from the beginning. The first 90 days were not glamorous. Chairmanship, Julian quickly discovered, wasn't a throne. It was structure, oversight, the unglamorous architecture of making sure a company couldn't be quietly hollowed out again by someone with charm and no accountability. He rebuilt the approval chains from scratch, this time with redundancies that didn't depend on any single relationship, marital or otherwise. He implemented quarterly independent audits of every vendor relationship above a set threshold. He worked for the first time in years not around Vanessa but alongside her. 2 former partners rebuilding not a marriage, but something more sustainable. Mutual professional respect built on transparency instead of assumption. Their marriage did not survive. Julian had known, somewhere in those 11 days of building the fraud case, that it wouldn't. Not because Vanessa hadn't tried, in her own guarded way, to repair what had broken, but because Julian had spent 6 months in a windowless office discovering something about himself that made returning to the old dynamic impossible. He had learned to advocate for himself. He had learned that quiet wasn't the same as invisible, and that he no longer wanted a partnership, marital or professional, where he had to prove his value after the fact instead of having it recognized from the start. The divorce was finalized quietly, without the drama a lesser story might have demanded. Vanessa didn't fight it. In some private, complicated way, Julian believed she understood it was the fairest outcome for both of them. 2 people who had built something extraordinary together and then gradually stopped building it together at all. What surprised him more than the divorce's quiet finality was how the professional relationship strengthened in its wake. Freed from the weight of a marriage neither of them could fully repair, Vanessa Cade and Julian Reyes became, over the following year, one of the most effective CEO-chairman pairings in the industry, profiled eventually in a business journal feature that neither of them mentioned to the other but both privately read twice. Damon Ashcroft pleaded guilty to wire fraud 8 months later, sentenced to 18 months and full restitution. A fraction of the actual damage, but enough, Priya assured Julian, to serve as a very public warning to anyone else who mistook a founder's silence for absence of oversight. Eleanor Voss retired from the board 18 months after the vote, but not before pulling Julian aside at her farewell dinner. "You never once asked me why I chose to fight for you," she said, "back when everyone else in that boardroom was ready to let you disappear quietly." "I assumed it was the fraud," Julian said. "The fraud was the evidence," Eleanor corrected. "But I chose to fight for you the day you walked out of that first meeting without raising your voice, without begging, without a single word of self-pity, just quiet, absolute clarity about what had been done to you. Companies don't need executives who perform outrage, Julian. They need people who understand exactly what's happening and choose deliberately when and how to respond." Julian thought about that often in the months and years that followed, The windowless office, the 11 days of quiet, methodical work, the vote that had changed not just his title, but the entire architecture of a company he'd helped build from nothing. He had never once raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. 2 years after the vote, Julian Reyes stood in the same boardroom. No longer the smallest office on the floor, no longer a footnote in someone else's restructuring memo, and watched Kate Reyes Holdings ring the opening bell on its public offering. A decision the board had made unanimously under the governance structure he'd rebuilt from the ground up. Vanessa stood beside him during the ceremony, not as his wife, but as his CEO, a distinction that, 2 years earlier, would have seemed impossible to imagine surviving intact. They had built something different in the wreckage of their marriage. Not friendship, not quite, but a professional partnership grounded in something their marriage had lost long before Damon Ashcroft ever entered the picture. Mutual, unflinching honesty. "You were right," Vanessa told him quietly, watching the numbers climb on the screen above the trading floor. "About all of it. I just couldn't hear it from you back then. I needed to hear it from a boardroom instead." Julian didn't need the acknowledgement the way he might have 2 years ago, standing in a windowless office reading a restructuring email that had erased him in 3 sentences. But he accepted it anyway because forgiveness, the professional kind, if not the personal kind, was worth more built on truth than on convenient silence. "I never wanted your job, Vanessa," he said. "I wanted to matter in the company I helped build. There's a difference. I know that now." He thought sometimes about the version of himself who might have reacted differently that first morning, who might have shouted, threatened, demanded, made the betrayal about wounded pride instead of quiet, deliberate correction. That version of Julian might have won a shorter, angrier battle. He would never have won a chairmanship built on unanimous board trust, or the kind of institutional respect that took 11 days of methodical work to earn rather than 11 minutes of righteous fury to demand and then lose just as quickly. Priya Malhotra, now the company's chief legal officer, found him after the ceremony, 2 champagne glasses in hand, one of which, she'd remembered without needing to ask, was sparkling water. "You never celebrate properly," she said, handing it to him. "I'm celebrating," Julian said. "This is what it looks like." "You're impossible," Priya said, but she was smiling. "For what it's worth, Eleanor called this morning. She wanted me to tell you something before you got swept into the ceremony." "What's that?" she said. "Tell the chairman the quiet man in the corner office finally got the whole building." Julian laughed. A real laugh. The first genuinely light moment he could remember in longer than he wanted to admit. It wasn't triumph in the way revenge fantasies promise triumph. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public humiliation of the people who'd wronged him, no scene worthy of a movie's climax. There had only been patience, evidence, and a boardroom full of people who, eventually, saw exactly what he'd always been. Not an afterthought in someone else's story, but the foundation the entire structure had been quietly built on all along. He looked out over the trading floor at the company's name scrolling across the ticker. The same name that had once excluded him from its own lobby screen, now inseparable from the governance model he'd rebuilt with his own hands, in 11 quiet nights, without ever raising his voice. Somewhere, in another windowless office in another company, Julian knew there was probably another quiet person being underestimated right now. Sidelined, dismissed, told their silence meant they had nothing left to offer. He hoped, if that person was watching closely enough, they'd understand what he'd learned the hard way. Silence was never weakness. It was simply patience, waiting for the exact moment truth could no longer be ignored. And when that moment came, it wouldn't need to shout. It would only need to be undeniable.